The whistle was the first thing Everett Cole heard when he opened his eyes that morning. Two low notes, separated by less than a heartbeat, the exact recall signal his uncle Harlan had used at Camp Ashwood when Everett was 12. It should not have been possible. Harlan had been dead for 2 weeks, and Everett had not heard that signal outside his own memory in more than 30 years. Everett lay still in the back of the van, staring at the rust spreading across the ceiling panel, and listened for it again. Nothing followed. Only Duke breathing against his hip, rain ticking softly on the roof, and the wind whirring a loose strip of siding somewhere beyond the storage lot. He told himself it was a dream. He had learned not to trust that sentence. 3 days later, on a burned hillside in the Appalachian foothills of Western Virginia, the same two notes would rise through a fracture above a vault hidden for 22 years. Duke would hear them too. The German shepherd's good ear would turn first, then the permanently bent one, and he would cross the ruins of Kennel Block C to a crack in the concrete no human eye had noticed. Before the second week ended, a cutting torch would open a steel hatch beneath that floor, and men with money, contracts, and reasons to fear what lay below it would try to close the door again with Everett still inside. But that was later. First came a letter, a $1 deed, a locked gate, and a lawyer who insisted on telling Everett exactly how hard his dead uncle had fought before she placed 600 condemned acres in his hands. Everett Cole was 46 years old, and by any measure that mattered on paper, he had nothing. He owned a 2004 cargo van with a mattress bolted to a plywood platform in the back, a single-burner stove, and a German shepherd named Duke who slept against his hip every night, whether Everett wanted the company or not. He worked 4 nights a week as a security guard at a self-storage facility outside Roanoke, walking the rows of orange roll-up doors with a flashlight he didn't need because the lot had motion sensor floods every 20 feet, checking locks that were never broken, filling out logs that no one ever read. Until 2 weeks earlier, Everett had only one living relative he spoke to with any regularity, Harlan Cole, his father's older brother, a retired Army canine trainer, whose patience with damaged dogs had always exceeded his patience with damaged men. Now Harlan was dead. He had not seen Harlan Cole in 4 years when the call came that he had passed in his sleep at 71, alone in a rented room above a hardware store in a town Everett had never visited, and that he had left something for his nephew that required Everett's presence in person to receive. Everett almost didn't go. He had $4.11 to his name that week after gas, and the storage facility didn't pay for missed shifts, and grief for a man he'd barely spoken to in years felt like an indulgence he couldn't afford. But Duke had gotten into the passenger seat before Everett finished deciding, the way he sometimes did when he'd made up his own mind about a thing, and Everett had looked at him for a long moment and then gone back inside for his jacket. The lawyer's office was in a strip mall between a nail salon and a defunct video rental store, and the lawyer herself, a woman named Diane Marsh with silver-streaked hair pulled back hard enough to look like a decision rather than a style, met him at the door with a folder and an expression Everett had learned over the years to recognize as a specific caution people wore when they were about to hand you something heavier than it looked. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I served 8 years in a support battalion attached to the 5th Special Forces Group before law school. I say that because what I'm about to tell you is going to sound like I'm reading you a fortune, and I want you to know I'm not the type." She slid the folder across the desk. Inside was a will, 3 pages, notarized, leaving Everett $400 in a checking account, a 1998 pickup with a cracked windshield, a footlocker of personal effects, and Harlan's beneficial interest in an old Cole family land trust. The trust held 612 acres in Bath County, Virginia, formerly known as Camp Ashwood Canine Training Facility. The Army had occupied the land under a long-term defense lease with a reversion clause. When Camp Ashwood was decommissioned 22 years earlier, title returned to the family trust instead of remaining federal property. Harlan later amended the trust so his designated heir could take personal title for $1 before the next condemnation hearing. Diane held out her hand. Everett took one of the 4 crumpled bills from his pocket and gave it to her. She witnessed his acceptance, signed the receipt, slid the deed across the desk and said, "Camp Ashwood is yours." The county had spent 2 decades trying to seize and auction the property for back taxes and structural hazards, and Harlan had spent nearly everything he owned preventing it. Clipped to the will was a single handwritten page, Harlan's cramped, careful print, addressed simply, Everett. If you're reading this, I ran out of time before I ran out of nerve, which is about the most honest thing I can say about the last 22 years of my life. I couldn't finish it. I think you can. Don't sell the camp. Not to anyone. Not for any number. Not until you've walked every building on it, especially Kennel Block C. There's a whistle in my footlocker. It was Danny's. You'll understand when you find what's under the floor. I should have refused the first lie and told Danny's family the whole truth before anyone could close the file. I told myself I was protecting people. What I protected was the report that protected a contract. Forgive me or don't. Just don't let it stay buried the way I did. H. Everett read it twice. Duke, lying across his boots under the desk, lifted his head and looked toward the window, toward the direction of the mountains none of them could see from a strip mall parking lot, and made a low sound in his chest that was not quite a whine. Who's Danny? Everett asked. Diane Marsh's jaw tightened just slightly, the way a person's does when they are choosing a sentence with more care than the sentence itself would suggest. I don't know, she said, but I know Harlan spent more than $86,000 of his retirement over 2 decades, including payments to an attorney who represented him before I did, fighting 3 separate county attempts to force a sale of that land. Nobody fights that hard over 600 acres of condemned buildings in the middle of nowhere unless there's a reason that isn't on paper. What kind of reason? That, she said, is exactly what I don't know. And it's the first time in 11 years of practicing law that not knowing has bothered me this much. The camp itself sat behind a chained gate off a county road that hadn't seen a grader in years, the asphalt broken into dark islands surrounded by gravel and weed. A sign, rusted through in patches, still read U.S. Army, Camp Ashwood Canine Training Facility. Restricted, though the fence beside it sagged low enough in 3 places that any determined deer could clear it without breaking stride. Everett parked the van, cut the engine, and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel before Duke's insistence, a single sharp bark, then a paw against the door panel, got him moving. The camp had the particular quiet of a place built for purpose and then abandoned mid-sentence. A long, low administration building with broken windows, a row of 6 kennel blocks, lettered A through F, cinder block construction, roofs sagging under 2 decades of unmaintained snow load. An obstacle course gone to saplings, a firing range with a berm still visible under a green fur of growth, and past all of it, half swallowed by the tree line, a scorched black scar in the earth that nothing had grown back over in 22 years, roughly the size and shape of what had once, Everett would later learn, been Kennel Block C. Duke went there first, not to the administration building where the footlocker presumably waited, and not to the pickup parked under the collapsed carport. He crossed the old parade ground with his nose low and his tail level, following no visible track, until he reached the blackened footprint of Kennel Block C. Near the rear wall he stopped, lifted his muzzle, and sampled the air in short, controlled breaths. A thread of cold air touched Everett's wrist when he knelt beside him, too steady to be ordinary wind and too cold to have come from sun-warmed rubble. Duke did not step onto the burned ground that first afternoon. He sat at its edge and stared toward the same narrow fracture in the slab, as if the scent beneath it had given him a direction, but not yet permission. Everett caught up, breathing harder than the walk should have cost him, and looked down at what remained. A rectangle of scorched foundation, chunks of collapsed cinder block furred with moss, rebar bent and rusted into shapes like broken fingers reaching up out of the dirt. Somewhere under old growth at the far end, a metal sign lay face down in the leaves. He turned it over with his boot. Kennel Block C. It read, the paint mostly gone. Danger, structure compromised. Do not enter. Danny, Everett said out loud to no one, testing the shape of the name against the burned ground, and Duke's ears, the good one and the bent one both, came up at the sound of it, as though the boom, too, was waiting for the rest of the sentence. A gust moved across the foundation. Somewhere under the debris, metal answered with 2 weak notes. Low, close together, almost lost beneath the leaves. Duke's head snapped toward the rear wall. Everett heard it clearly enough to feel the skin tighten across his arms, But when he crossed the rubble and listened again, the sound was gone. He did not get the rest of the sentence that day. He got a padlock he had to cut with bolt cutters bought on the last of his gas money, a footlocker that smelled of cedar and motor oil, and inside it, wrapped in a chamois cloth gone stiff with age, a silver training whistle tarnished nearly black, with 2 letters scratched crudely into the barrel by hand. DR. Beneath it lay a maintenance map of Kennel Block C, and, wrapped separately in waxed cloth, a short corroded sleeve cut from an old ventilation pipe. A red pencil circle marked the ventilation run beneath the rear wall, and the same red corrosion dust clung to the map, the cloth, and the fitting. He put it in his jacket pocket. It sat there like a stone the rest of the day, and that night, lying in the back of the van in the gravel lot behind the old administration building, because he had nowhere else to be, and the camp, condemned or not, was his now. He took it out and turned it over in the moonlight, coming through the windshield, and Duke lifted his head off the floor mat and stared at it with an attention that had nothing casual in it at all. Everett put it to his lips, once, just to see. He didn't blow hard enough to make a sound. He couldn't make himself. The cold metal against Everett's mouth pulled a whole history forward before he could stop it. The whistle had belonged to Daniel Reyes, according to Harlan's letter, but the sound it represented belonged first to a summer Everett had spent here as a boy. Everett was 12 years old the summer he learned what the whistle meant. He remembered it in pieces now, the way childhood summers always fractured into a handful of scenes that stood in for years he couldn't otherwise access. His uncle crouched at the edge of the training field, a green young Malinois straining at the end of a long lead, and a low 2-note whistle pitched just above a hum that stopped the dog cold mid-stride, all 4 paws braced, ears up, waiting. Volume's not the trick of it, Harlan had told him, handing him the whistle to try, watching Everett fumble the pitch entirely wrong the first 6 times. Any fool can make a dog flinch by hollering. The trick is making a sound the dog trusts more than his own instinct to keep running. That takes time. That takes the dog knowing, bone deep, that when you call him back, you've never once called him back into something worse than what he was running toward. Everett had asked him, that same summer, why he didn't just yell like the other trainers on the base did. Harlan had looked at him for a long moment, in the particular way adults sometimes looked at a question that was really about something else entirely, and said only, "Yelling's for men who've stopped trusting the dog to listen." I've never had that problem yet. Harlan Cole was Everett's uncle, his father's older brother, a man who had spent 30 years training military working dogs before the Army decided his knees couldn't take the field anymore and put him in charge of a regional training facility instead, a place called Camp Ashwood, tucked into 600 acres of ridge and hollow in the Virginia foothills, where new handlers came to learn what a dog could smell that a man could not, and where working dogs washed out of other programs sometimes came for a second evaluation before anyone gave up on them completely. Everett had spent 2 childhood summers at Ashwood before his uncle's divorce, and his own father's drinking had pulled the family apart into pieces that never quite reassembled. He remembered a low whistle Harlan used instead of a verbal command, a sound pitched just so that could stop a dog running full speed across a field in under 2 seconds. He remembered his uncle's hands, thick-knuckled and patient, guiding a puppy's nose toward a scent cone. He remembered being 12 years old and thinking that his uncle was the calmest man he had ever known. He had been a staff sergeant in the United States Army for 11 years, a military working dog handler for 8 of them, deployed 3 times, and he had left the service with a Purple Heart, a permanent limp that showed up in cold weather like an old debt collector, and a silence that had grown so total over the years that his own voice sometimes surprised him when he used it. He did not talk about the limp. He did not talk about the scar that ran from his left hip to his knee, a puckered white seam left by shrapnel from a vehicle that had rolled after an IED took its front axle, or about the 11 minutes he had spent afterward in the collapsed space beneath it, water from a ruptured line rising past his chest while he waited for hands that took too long to reach him. He had gotten out. His dog at the time, a Malinois named Cash, had not been so lucky, and Everett had carried that the way some men carry debt, quietly at compound interest, for the rest of their lives. Duke had come after. Duke did not know about Cash. Duke only knew that when Everett went still and his breathing changed and his eyes stopped tracking anything in the room, The correct response was to press his skull against Everett's knee and lean hard until the weight of him pulled Everett's attention back down to earth. Duke was 9 years old, black and tan, 60 pounds of coiled patience, with a left ear that had never healed right after a training accident when he was young. Not the accident, not the one that mattered later, just an ordinary mishap with a kennel gate. And it gave him a slightly quizzical look even when he was at his most serious, which was often. Everett had adopted Duke retired in place from a canine unit 2 states over, a dog too old for patrol work and too steady to spend retirement in a kennel, and in 3 years the two of them had built the kind of understanding that did not require words, which suited Everett fine because words were the thing he had the least use for. He thought of that sentence often, later, in places his uncle could never have imagined. In the dark under an overturned vehicle, in a canine kennel at 2 in the morning with a Malinois too spooked by a helicopter's rotor wash to hold still, in the back of a cargo van with a German shepherd's weight pressed against his ribs, on nights the past came back too loud. He had never mastered the whistle himself. But he had understood, eventually, exactly what his uncle meant by it, and had spent years building the same kind of trust with Duke the long way, without ever needing a sound to carry it. By the time the memory released him, the whistle was still unblown in his hand, and Duke was watching his face, not the metal. Everett understood then that the inheritance was not only land. Harlan had left him the one object most capable of opening every locked room in his own past. He was still holding it when headlights swept across the gravel outside, far too smooth and far too quiet for the county road's ruts, and a black SUV eased to a stop at the broken gate, engine idling. Lights aimed directly at the van, like a question that expected an answer. Duke was on his feet and against the door before the SUV's driver had even stepped out. A low sound building in his chest that Everett had heard exactly twice before in 3 years, both times right before something happened that he wished hadn't. A man got out. Mid-30s, gym-built in the specific way that is suggested a trainer rather than labor, wearing a quarter-zip pullover with a small embroidered logo Everett couldn't read at this distance, and an expression of practiced, unhurried friendliness that arrived a half-second too late to be believed. "Didn't mean to startle you," the man called, hands loose and visible at his sides. The posture of someone who had been taught exactly how to look non-threatening while doing something that was, in fact, a threat. "Saw the gate was open. This is private land." "Well, it was until a few days ago, from what I understand. You must be Mr. Cole." Everett said nothing. Duke's growl had not stopped. "Preston Vantage," the man said, and did not offer his hand, because the dog between them made that impossible, and something in his eyes flickered. Not fear exactly, but the particular irritation of a man unused to being denied a gesture he'd planned to make. "My family's company held the original site support contract here, back when this place was still active. We've kept half an eye on the property for old time's sake. I'll be honest with you, Mr. Cole. My grandfather always hoped somebody in the Cole family would finally sell this place so it could stop being a headache for everybody. County's been trying to condemn it and auction it for the tax debt for years. We'd be glad to make that simple. Take it off your hands. Fair price, quick closing, no walkthrough required. I know a place like this isn't easy to stand in for long." "Not selling," Everett said. It was the first thing he'd said out loud in almost 18 hours, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. Preston Vantage smiled, and the smile did not move his eyes at all. "Of course," he said, "nobody has to decide anything tonight, but I'd think carefully before you go poking around those old buildings, Mr. Cole. Structurally, this whole site's a liability. County condemned half of it decades ago. Some of what's still standing could come down on a man's head without warning." His eyes shifted only once toward the scorched footprint of Kennel Block C. "Wouldn't want an accident. This place has had enough of those." He got back in the SUV before Eddie could answer, and the taillights disappeared down the county road into a dark that swallowed sound as completely as it swallowed light, and Everett stood in the gravel with the whistle still in his hand, and Duke pressed hard against his leg, and understood, the way he had once understood, the difference between an ordinary night patrol and one where every hair on his arm stood up for no reason he could point to, that he had just been warned, politely, by a man who intended to make good on it. He looked down at Duke. Duke was still staring at the space where the SUV's taillights had vanished, ears up, body rigid, and did not relax for a long time. "Yeah," Everett said quietly. "I don't like him either." Morning came gray and wet, fog sitting low in the hollow, the way it must have every morning for 22 years, whether anyone was there to see it or not. And Everett spent the first hour of daylight doing what any sane man would do after a warning like the one he'd gotten. He walked the property line, fence post to fence post, cataloging every place a man could get onto the land without using the gate, and found 6. He was not, he told himself, staying because of a dead man's letter. He was staying because he owned 600 acres now, condemned or not, and a man named Vantage had shown up within 24 hours of the deed transferring, wanting to buy it fast and quiet. And Everett Cole had spent 11 years in the Army, learning that when someone wants something badly enough to show up in person and lie about why, the thing itself is usually worth more than they're offering. He called the number on Diane Marsh's card from the gas station 2 miles down the county road, the only place with reliable signal, and told her about the visit. "Vantage," she repeated, and he heard something shift in her voice, a lawyer's version of a soldier hearing incoming before the sound reaches conscious thought. "As in Vantage Defense Solutions?" "Guy said his family held a site support contract here. Preston Vantage." "Marcus Vantage's nephew," Diane said. "I know the name because Vantage Defense Solutions has held government logistics and equipment contracts in this region for almost 30 years. Training gear, kennel infrastructure, tactical supply, the unglamorous stuff nobody thinks about until it fails. If they had the support contract at Camp Ashwood back when your uncle ran it, and they're the reason the county's tax assessors have been circling this property for 2 decades trying to force a sale nobody in your family would agree to." She let the sentence trail the way she had in her office, and Everett understood by now that this was how she thought out loud, testing weight before she'd commit to a shape. "Mr. Cole, I want to come out there today if you can wait that long, and I want to bring someone." She arrived a little after 3 in a Subaru with 200,000 miles on it and county dust already ground into the paint. And the someone she brought was a broad, unhurried man in his 60s named Frank Okafor, a retired Army records specialist who had spent 31 years managing military archives before opening a small private research practice that specialized, he explained while shaking Everett's hand with both of his, in exactly this kind of thing: old bases, old contracts, old silences that had outlived the men who'd built them. "Diane called me an hour after you left her office yesterday," Frank said, setting a battered canvas satchel on the tailgate. "I pulled the public closure index before we drove out. Camp Ashwood is listed as decommissioned after a structural fire, but the casualty field is sealed and the equipment inventory ends 6 weeks before the closure date. Records do not usually stop before the event that supposedly explains them. I also sent the facility code to Grace Liu, a casualty records researcher I trust. She is not coming here unless we find a name, but she is already looking. I'd like to help you find out what your uncle was protecting, if you'll let me." "Why?" Everett asked. "Would you want to?" Frank Okafor looked at him for a long moment, and something in his face made Everett understand this was not a question the man was used to being asked, or perhaps a question he asked himself more than most people knew. "I spent 3 decades filing the paperwork that let the Army forget things it found inconvenient to remember," he said finally. "I got good at it. I got promoted for it. About 8 years before I retired, I found a supply requisition that didn't match the incident report filed against it, over an accident that killed a man I'd trained alongside 20 years earlier. And I asked one question about it at the wrong dinner, and I was reassigned to a different post within a month. I never asked again. I've been trying to make up for that ever since, one dead file at a time." He hefted the satchel. "So, where's the whistle your uncle left you?" Everett brought it out of his jacket. Frank turned it over under the gray afternoon light, angling it, and stopped at the 2 scratched letters. "DR," he read it aloud. "Cole, do you have any service record for a handler with those initials assigned here? Even secondhand, a rumor, a name somebody mentioned once and never again." Everett didn't. He turned the whistle once in his palm and noticed a faint line of reddish dust packed into the seam near the mouthpiece, the same color as the corroded metal exposed at the rear of Block C. Before he could say so, Duke moved without being called. The dog crossed the burn foundation for the second time, nose low, pausing twice to test the air. At the shifted slab, he inhaled sharply, traced a widening scent cone 3 paces downwind, then returned to the crack and began to dig. It was not frantic digging, and it was not play. Duke worked in a disciplined rhythm, clearing soil from the edge of the slab, stopping every few seconds to put his nose into the opening. When Everett lowered his own hand to the gap, he felt a steady breath of cold air carrying damp concrete, machine oil, rodent musk, and the dry mineral smell of a sealed underground room. "Sergeant Cole," Frank said quietly, "I'd let him work." It took Duke almost 20 minutes to clear enough soil and ash-blackened debris to expose what he was after. Not bone, not the grim thing Everett's stomach had quietly, dreadfully prepared for, but a rusted steel hatch, roughly 2 feet square, set into a poured concrete slab beneath where the Kennel Block's floor had been. A slab that had clearly been built separately from the building above it, deeper, older, deliberate. "That's not part of a kennel foundation," Frank said, crouching beside the exposed steel. "Utility vault or emergency shelter, poured separately from the building above it. The crack is acting like a vent." Duke did not smell a 22-year-old person through concrete. He found moving air from a void, then followed the strongest point of the scent cone. Everett showed him the red corrosion inside the whistle seam. Frank compared it with the rust on a thin pipe disappearing under the slab. "And somebody once kept this whistle close to the same kind of iron dust. Your uncle may have left more than one clue." It took the four of them, Shin, Everett, Diane, Frank, and Wade Higgins, a leathery, sharp-tongued 68-year-old who ran the only working tow truck and general hauling service in the county, and who Diane had called in for the simple reason that nobody else nearby owned a functioning cutting torch, most of the next day to open it. Wade had shown up at dawn in a truck older than Everett's. Chewing on an unlit cigar, he claimed he'd quit smoking, but not holding. Taken one look at the operation, and declared the entire situation the most interesting thing to happen in this county since the water tower fell on Ronnie Pruitt's barn, before setting to work without being asked twice. "You're not from around here," Wade said to Everett at one point, apropos of nothing, working the torch in careful passes through a welded security bar that crossed the lid, leaving the original hinge and lifting ring intact. "I'd know you if you were. Coles used to farm the Ashwood side of the ridge before the Army leased it from them in the 50s. Harlan's granddad. Good land, by the way. Terrible luck. That family's had more bad luck per acre than anybody I ever met, and I've buried 3 wives, so I know a thing or two about luck." "You knew my uncle?" "Knew him well enough to owe him a favor I never got to pay back," Wade said, and didn't elaborate, and something in the set of his jaw told Everett not to push it yet. They worked through the middle of the day in shifts, the torch too hot to run continuously against the welded security bar without transferring enough heat to warp the lid, and in the long pauses while the metal cooled, Wade talked in the unhurried way of a man who had learned that silence made strangers nervous, and he had no particular interest in making anybody more nervous than the situation already demanded. 19 years ago, my youngest boy got himself in trouble with some fellas out of Covington. Nothing that would have killed him, but plenty that would have ruined him. A stolen truck, mostly, and bad company he didn't have the sense yet to walk away from," he said, running a rag over the torch nozzle. "Harlan Cole didn't know my boy from Adam, but he heard about it at the feed store the way everybody hears everything in a county this size, and he drove out to where those boys were holed up and talked my son into walking home on his own 2 feet before the sheriff ever got involved. Never told me how he did it. Never asked for a thing in return. Either, not then, not in the 18 years after. I used to bring him firewood some winters. He'd take it and might grumble about not needing charity and then thank me anyway, like both things were equally true." Wade set the rag down and looked toward the burned foundation, the sign still lying face up in the grass where Everett had left it. "I always figured someday he'd need something bigger than firewood, and I'd finally get to pay it back proper. Didn't figure it'd be this, but I reckon it counts." Frank, listening, made a small sound that might have been agreement, and went back to photographing the welded security bar, the original hinge, and the exterior latch before Wade cut only the bar. Evidence, he said, in case anyone later asked how they had opened the hatch, or whether they had altered its locking points. The hatch gave near dusk with a groan of metal that had not moved in 2 decades. Cold, stale air rose out of the dark carrying dust, old paper, machine oil, and something faintly metallic. As the pressure shifted, air rushed through the narrow, corroded pipe Everett had noticed beneath the slab. The pipe produced 2 low notes, one after the other. The sound from the ruins, close enough to Harlan's recall signal to make Duke lift both ears. Wind crossing a split seam in the abandoned vent explained what Duke had heard on the hillside. It did not explain what Everett had heard in the van outside Roanoke 3 mornings earlier. The map and Daniel Reyes's real whistle proved Harlan had intended the vent to lead someone downward. Whether the first call had been memory, coincidence, or something else remained Everett's alone to decide. He made himself go down the ladder first. Duke tried to follow, and Everett held up a hand. "Stay." And for once, remarkably, the dog obeyed, though he paced the lip of the hatch the entire time, ears flat, whining low in his throat. The vault below was roughly the size of a 2-car garage, poured concrete walls sweating with damp, a single steel filing cabinet against the far wall, a workbench with hand tools rusted into uselessness, and stacked with a care that told Everett someone had done this deliberately, not in a panic, not at the last minute, dozens of sealed plastic storage bins, their lids gone brittle and yellow with age, but intact. Bolted beside the ladder was the lower end of the corroded vent pipe. A faded red survey mark had been painted around it, and beneath the mark someone had scratched a small H into the concrete. Everett remembered the reddish dust in Daniel's whistle and understood the method. Harlan had stored the whistle with the old site map and a corroded vent fitting in his footlocker so that anyone patient enough to compare them could confirm the vault belonged to the story, not to coincidence. A closure work order sealed inside a wax document sleeve bolted beside the ladder answered another question before anyone asked it. 6 weeks after the fire, after the official incident report had been issued, but before demolition crews pushed the damaged walls over the slab, Harlan had been assigned to inventory and secure surviving records. He had used that final access window to move copies, damaged hardware, and witness statements into the utility vault. The rubble that later concealed the hatch had not trapped the evidence by accident. Harlan had placed it there, sealed it, and then spent the rest of his life making sure the land above it could not be sold. He opened the nearest one. Training logs, handwritten, dated across a 2-year span, ending 22 years and 4 months ago, signed at the bottom of each entry in a cramped, careful print Everett had last seen an hour earlier on a letter in a strip mall law office, his uncle's hand. Page after page of routine entries, scent detection drills, obedience evaluations, equipment maintenance notes. Until near the bottom of the third bin, the entries changed in tone entirely. Equipment failure, handler injury, again, Harlan had written. The letters pressed hard enough into the page that Everett could feel the indent with his thumb. Third incident in 6 weeks with the new tether release harnesses. Reported to Vantage rep on site. Told units are within spec. Handler error. These are not handler errors. I've trained handlers for 20 years. I know the difference between a man making a mistake and equipment failing under him. Another entry, dated 11 days later, requested full recall of harness batch pending independent inspection. Denied by contract office, cites active duty timeline, says recall would breach delivery schedule penalties written into the Vantage support contract. Told to continue live fire tether drills as scheduled. I don't like this. DR doesn't like it either, and DR has better instincts than most officers I've served under. Frank Okafor, reading over Everett's shoulder in the vault's single battery lantern light, went very still. DR, he said, there's your name. A second bin opened an hour later once Frank's back could take another stretch of crouching on the cold floor, held something that made even Wade go quiet. A slim manila folder, water-stained but legible, marked in Harlan's hand simply PA. Incident follow-up containing a handwritten statement, 3 pages in a different script entirely, careful and slanted and clearly written by someone whose hand had not been entirely steady. I am writing this down because Harlan asked me to, and because I don't trust that anyone else ever will, Priya Anand had written, dated 9 days after the fire. My arms will carry the marks of that night for the rest of my life, and I have been told, in language I understood perfectly well, despite how carefully it was worded, that continuing to describe the cause of my injuries as equipment failure rather than handler error contributing would jeopardize both my medical discharge benefits and any future employment reference from this command. I have 3 dogs to feed and a mother in a nursing facility I cannot afford without those benefits. I am signing what they have put in front of me. I am not agreeing with it. There is a difference, and I hope someday somebody reads this and understands that the difference mattered to me even when nobody would let it matter on paper. They didn't just silence a dead man's record, Frank said quietly, setting the folder down on the workbench with a care that bordered on reverence. They silenced a living witness too, and they did it by threatening her survival instead of her freedom. That's a harder thing to prosecute, Sergeant Cole, but it's not a smaller crime for being quieter. A third container answered the question Everett had not yet been willing to ask. If Harlan had known all of this, why had he waited 22 years for a nephew he barely spoke to? Inside were 3 disclosure packets, each complete, each sent by certified mail. The first had gone to the installation inspector general 9 months after the fire and had been returned with a finding that Harlan's copies could not supersede the official incident file. The second had gone to Army Contract Council and had been closed after Vantage argued the records were unauthorized duplicates. The third, mailed to a congressional district office 7 years later, had been referred back to the same command that had approved the original report. There was also a letter from Priya Inman, written during the first year after her discharge. She did not ask Harlan to forget. She asked him not to release her signed statement while her medical benefits and her mother's nursing care could still be challenged. Harlan had honored that request, then spent years trying to build a case that did not require Priya to risk the only support keeping her family afloat. By the time her settlement restrictions expired, the original vendor had been reorganized, witnesses had scattered, and every agency Harlan contacted treated the matter as an old grievance already adjudicated. At the bottom of the box lay Harlan's own unsigned confession. He admitted that on the morning after the fire he had allowed the first sanitized summary to leave Camp Ashwood, because Command Council told him Daniel's family would receive benefits faster if no contractor dispute delayed the finding. He had told himself he was protecting Daniel's mother and Priya. By the time he understood that the compromise had become the foundation of the cover-up, his signature was being used to discredit every objection he made. He had not remained silent for 22 years. He had spoken into rooms designed not to hear him, and he had never forgiven himself for the one day he helped close the door. The final entry in that bin, dated the day before the fire, was shorter than the others, the handwriting less careful, as though written fast or written by a hand that was shaking. Tomorrow's drill uses batch 4 harnesses again. I told the contract rep I would not run it without inspection. He said the Army would run it whether I signed off or not, that my objection was noted and irrelevant. Daniel Reyes says he'll run it himself if I won't clear it. Doesn't want a junior handler taking the risk instead. I don't know what to do. I am going to sleep on it and refuse again in the morning. I am not going to let a boy die over a delivery schedule. There was no entry after that. There didn't need to be. That evening, the 4 of them ate dinner together for the first time. Canned stew heated on Everett's single-burner stove, split into mismatched bowls Wade produced from somewhere in his truck bed, eaten sitting on overturned crates around a fire ring someone had cleared of 2 decades of leaf litter, and something in the shared exhaustion of the day loosened all of them enough to talk plainly for the first time since arriving. I keep thinking about what kind of man does this work for 30 years, Diane said, watching the fire, and still can't bring himself to just walk away from 600 acres of bad memories when every sane incentive in the world was telling him to sell and move on. I've represented clients who wouldn't fight this hard to keep custody of a child. Grief makes strange architects, Frank said. I've seen men build whole careers out of trying to fix one thing they couldn't fix the first time. I nearly became one of them myself the year I let that dinner conversation go instead of asking my second question. He looked at Everett across the fire. Your uncle asked his second question, and his third, and apparently every question after that for 22 years. That's rarer than people think, Sergeant Cole. Most men ask once, get told to be quiet, and are quiet forever after. Everett didn't say much that night, which surprised no one, but he stayed at the fire longer than he'd stayed anywhere with other people, in longer than he could easily remember, Duke's head heavy in his lap, and found himself thinking, not for the first time that week, That his uncle's stubbornness had not been loneliness from all, not entirely. It had simply been waiting for the right company to finally arrive. Grace Lou arrived the following afternoon. Frank had already sent her the facility code before the vault opened. After DR became Daniel Reyes and Priya Anand's statement surfaced, Diane called and asked her to come in person. Grace was a soft-spoken woman in her 50s with a silver-gray braid and a canvas messenger bag that seemed too small to hold the weight of what she did for a living. Standing in the vault doorway, she described that work simply. I find the names the paperwork tried to lose. I work with the Department of Defense's Casualty and Missing Personnel System, and independently for families the system has stopped looking for, she said, setting her bag on the one dry patch of workbench. Frank's facility code led me to a public accident index most people do not know exists. It lists one training-related fatality 22 years ago at a facility redacted for contractor liability reasons. No name, no unit, no explanation. When Frank called back with Daniel Reyes's initials, I searched the closed casualty cross-index. The entry is there, but the cause field points to a report the family was never allowed to see. I would like to know why. It took the 5 of them 3 more days, working the vault by lantern and later by a generator Wade produced from somewhere, and refused to explain, to piece together what the training logs, personnel rosters, and a batch of correspondence in the steel filing cabinet actually meant. Daniel Reyes had been 26 years old, a junior K-9 handler 2 years into his enlistment, assigned to Camp Ashwood under Harlan Cole's supervision, partnered with a young Belgian Malinois named Cato. On the morning of the fire, against Harlan's written objection, and under direct pressure from a Vantage Defense Solutions site representative, determined to keep a lucrative harness supply contract on schedule, Daniel Reyes had run a live tether release drill using equipment his own commanding officer had flagged, in writing, as defective. The tether failed at full extension during a bite and hold exercise near the block's rear wall, the recoil whipping a support cable into an unshielded junction box, sparking a fire that caught first in stored bedding and then in a compromised propane line feeding the block's heating system. Daniel Reyes had gone back in for Cato. Neither of them came out. A second handler working in adjacent lane, a woman named Priya Anand according to the roster, suffered severe burns pulling 3 other dogs clear before the roof came down and was medically discharged 8 months later with injuries that ended her career and, according to a single terse note in Harlan's log, a settlement she was made to sign that I still believe was written more to protect Vantage than to help her. The official Army incident report, filed 6 weeks after the fire and buried in the same vault, attributed the failure to handler procedural error in tether management, made no mention of the 3 prior equipment failures Harlan had documented and reported, and closed with a line that made Frank Okafor swear under his breath for the first time since Everett had met him. This incident does not indicate any defect in Vantage Defense Solutions tether release equipment currently under Army contract. No further inspection recommended. Everett asked Wade to bring the damaged hardware trays into the light. Among them, he found 2 warped release housings and a fractured spring pawl, all tagged with batch numbers matching Harlan's logs. He had serviced newer versions of the same mechanism during his own deployments. The casing had changed over the years, but the load-bearing geometry had not. Under a hard lateral pull, the PAL could cant inside its channel instead of releasing cleanly. Once he saw the wear marks, Everett could reconstruct the failure without Frank translating a single page. This was not one bad harness, Everett said. It was a release design that could bind under exactly the load the drill was built to create. If the company kept the mechanism and changed only the housing or product number, later batches could carry the same failure forward. Frank photographed the parts beside the corresponding log entries. From that point on, Everett was not merely the owner of the land or the handler whose dog had found the hatch. He became the person in the group best equipped to connect the paperwork to what the equipment had physically done. They found the rest of it in pieces, the way most true things get found. Not in one triumphant document, but scattered across a dozen mundane ones that only meant something once you'd read enough of them to see the shape underneath. A maintenance requisition, filed 2 weeks before the fire, for replacement tether release units that was denied in a single terse line, for budget timing inconsistent with current delivery milestones. A memo from a Vantage site representative, unsigned but matched by letterhead to the company's regional office, reminding Camp Ashwood's command that continued operational testing under existing equipment is contractually expected pending formal recall determination. Language Frank translated, flatly, as keep using the equipment we already know is failing. Because stopping costs us money and nobody's died enough times yet to make us stop. Grace spent 2 full days on the phone from the cab of Wade's truck, working through a genealogy database and a private network of contacts she'd built over 15 years doing this kind of work, cross-referencing the handful of names that appeared in the training logs against public records, obituaries, and a Department of Defense Casualty Affairs index that Frank had taught her how to search years earlier, back when they worked adjacent cases without knowing the other existed. Diane, meanwhile, drove the 90 minutes to the county courthouse twice that week, once to file the initial notice establishing the discovery on public record, and once, quietly, to pull every county tax and condemnation filing against the Ashwood property going back to the year of the fire, filings that showed, in bureaucratic language, stripped of all emotion, a pattern of increasingly aggressive attempts to force a sale, each one beaten back by an aging canine trainer with a used pickup truck in a legal fund that never seemed to run dry, no matter how many times the county's own attorneys assumed it must. 22 years, Diane said, laying the filings out across the tailgate like a hand of cards nobody wanted to play. 22 years of a man refusing to lose, one continuance at a time, on a piece of land everyone else in this county thought was worthless. I've represented a lot of stubborn clients, Mr. Cole. I don't think I've ever represented one this patient. Yet by the 4th night, working past dark with the generator humming and moths gathering thick around the single hanging work light Wade had rigged over the vault entrance, they had assembled enough, the training logs, the denied requisition, the unsigned memo, Priya Anand's statement, and the sanitized final incident report, to understand not just what had happened at Camp Ashwood 22 years earlier, but why it had been so easy for so long, for the truth of it to stay buried under a piece of ground nobody but one grieving trainer had ever cared enough to keep watch over. They didn't just cover up a death, Frank said, sitting back against the vault wall. They used the report to prevent an independent design review. The original batch is probably long gone, but procurement records show Vantage kept selling descendant models built around the same release mechanism. If the casing and product number changed while the binding geometry stayed the same, other units may still be training with the same defect under a different name. Everett sat with the training log open on his knees, Harlan's cramped handwriting blurring slightly in the lantern light, and thought about a man who had spent 22 years and every dollar he had fighting to keep a burned patch of ground instead of letting it be paved over. Because he could not undo what had happened, but he could, apparently, refuse for the rest of his life to let the ground itself forget. Duke, who had been allowed down into the vault by the second day once Everett judged the air safe in the space stable, lay near the hatch opening the entire time anyone worked, head on his paws, watching. He did not go near the filing cabinet. He did not sniff at the bins of paper the way Everett would have expected a working dog's curiosity to draw him. But every time someone read Daniel Reyes's name aloud, his ears came up, both of them, even the bent one, and he would lift his head and look toward the darkest corner of the vault as though listening for an answer that was 22 years too late to come. It was on the 5th day after the vault opened, with its contents partially cataloged, and Diane Marsh already drafting a sealed notice to send to the county courthouse, establishing a legal record of what had been found, that a woman appeared at the gate Everett had started, out of habit now, keeping chained. She introduced herself as Nora Keene, an independent investigative journalist who had spent the last 2 years researching defense contractor safety violations for a story she'd been unable to place with any outlet willing to risk the legal exposure, and she said she'd heard, through channels she declined to specify, that something significant had been found at the old Ashwood site. Duke did not like her. He did not growl or bark. He simply placed himself between Nora Keene and the path to the vault and held the position, calm enough to be controlled and deliberate enough that nobody mistook it for uncertainty. When she shifted her weight toward the evidence bins, Duke shifted with her. "He's not usually like this," Everett said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true anymore. "Dogs pick up on things," Nora said, "an edge of something, not quite defensiveness, more like fatigue in her voice. I've had 3 different sources go quiet on me in the last 6 months after I got close to Vantage Defense Solutions contract records. I don't blame him for being careful. I'm careful too. That's why I'm here in person instead of calling. Frank Okafor, watching from the vault entrance, said nothing for a long moment. And then, how'd you hear about this specific site, Miss Keene? Not the company, this site. Nobody's filed anything public yet. A source, she said. I protect my sources, even from people who might have good reasons for asking. It was not an answer, and everyone standing in the gravel lot that afternoon knew it was not an answer. And Everett Cole, who had spent 8 years reading men's faces in the half-second before they decided whether to trust him, watched Nora Keene's eyes and could not decide. Watching her decide the same thing about him, whether he was looking at an ally arriving early or a threat wearing a very good disguise. How long you been doing this kind of work? Frank asked her, before Everett could decide anything further. His tone conversational, but his eyes sharp in a way that suggested he was running his own quiet assessment alongside Duke's. 9 years, Nora said. 6 of them freelance, which is a polite way of saying 6 years of editors telling me a story was important but not fundable. I've had 2 apartments broken into in that time. I've had a source's brake line cut. Allegedly cut, nobody could ever prove it, which is exactly the point of doing it that way. I don't say that to make myself sound brave. I say it because I understand, better than most people who walk through that gate, exactly what it costs to be careless about who you trust. She reached slowly into her bag for a business card, and Duke's whole body tensed at the motion, a low sound rising in his throat that stopped her hand halfway. Easy, Everett said, not sure if he was talking to the dog or the woman. Nora withdrew her hand without the card, empty, palms open, and stood very still. I'll leave it on the gatepost, she said quietly. You don't have to take anything from my hand today. I'm not in a hurry. I've been chasing this story 2 years already. I can wait a few more days for a dog to decide I'm not a threat. It was, Everett would think later, the single most convincing thing she could have said, because it was the one thing a person actually working for the other side would never have thought to offer. Patience freely given, with no attempt to rush past the one judge in the conversation whose opinion nobody in that gravel lot was prepared to overrule. You can wait, he told her finally, outside the gate, until we know more. She did not argue. She also did not leave. Her small gray sedan stayed parked on the shoulder of the county road for the rest of that day and the next, visible from the camp's high ground, and Duke spent long stretches of both days sitting at the fence line, staring down the hill at it, refusing every attempt to call him back to work. From the camp's high ground, Everett saw Nora remain strictly on the public shoulder in the wooded ridge beyond the county right-of-way. Near dusk, she mounted a weatherproof high-gain directional recorder and a low-light trail camera to a survey stake on the public side of the boundary, photographed the placement with a timestamp, and emailed the coordinates to Diane. She explained through the gate that after 2 break-ins and 1 damaged source vehicle, she no longer watched a sensitive site without creating an independent record of who approached it. The explanation was professional and sensible. It did not make Everett trust her. A camera aimed toward his gate was still a camera aimed toward his gate, and Duke continued to sit at the fence line studying her sedan as if patience could reveal an allegiance. The phone call came on the 6th day after the vault opened, and Everett almost didn't answer it because the number was blocked, and blocked numbers had never once in his life brought him anything he wanted to hear. Mr. Cole. The voice was older than Preston's, drier, with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who had never in his life had to raise his voice to be listened to. My name is Marcus Vantage. I understand my nephew paid you a visit last week and made a poor impression. I'd like to apologize for that personally and to correct a few things he may have gotten wrong. Everett said nothing and let the silence do the work silence had always done for him in negotiations he hadn't asked to be part of. Vantage Defense Solutions has supported this country's defense infrastructure for 3 generations, Marcus Vantage continued, unbothered by the quiet. My father built this company from a single Army surplus contract into one of the most trusted names in the tactical equipment logistics in the Mid-Atlantic region. I built on what he left me, and someday, God willing, not too soon, my nephew will build on what I leave him. That's not a small thing to protect, Mr. Cole, and I think a man with your service record understands better than most what it means to protect something you've spent your life building. You calling to threaten me, Everett said, or to bore me, because I've got somewhere to be. A pause, brief, and when Marcus Vantage spoke again, something in his tone had thinned, just slightly. The smoothness pulled a fraction tighter over whatever sat underneath it. I'm calling, he said, to offer you $2 million for 600 acres the county currently values at less than 300,000 after tax liens, demolition estimates, and environmental remediation. I'm calling because your uncle was, in his own way, a man I respected, even when we disagreed. I'm calling to ask you not to let an old man's grief-driven paranoia become your inheritance too. Whatever he believed happened at that facility. Mr. Cole, it was investigated thoroughly by the United States Army 22 years ago and closed. Reopening old wounds doesn't bring anyone back. It only hurts the living who are left holding them. Duke, lying across Everett's boots on the tailgate where he'd taken the call, lifted his head at the change in Everett's breathing and pressed hard against his shin. Funny, Everett said slowly. You know exactly which wounds I'd be reopening. I never told you what I found. The line was quiet for a 2 count longer than it should have been. Take the offer, Mr. Cole, Marcus Vantage said, and the warmth was gone from his voice entirely now, filed down to something flat and precise. It expires Friday. I'd hate for circumstances to make the decision less pleasant than it needs to be. He ended the call before Everett could answer, and Everett sat on the tailgate for a long time afterward with the phone in his hand and Duke's weight pressed against his leg, and understood that he had just been told, as plainly as a man like Marcus Vantage was ever going to say it out loud, that the clock had started. That night, alone in the van with the whistle still in his hand and Marcus Vantage's $2 million figure sitting in his chest, like a stone he hadn't asked to swallow, Everett let himself think it through honestly, the way he tried to think through everything that mattered, without flinching from the parts that made him look small. $2 million was more money than he had ever expected to see in one place in his entire life. It was a real house, walls that didn't shudder in high wind, a truck that started every time instead of most times, medical coverage for the knee that had started clicking on cold mornings the way Harlan's once had. It was an end to 22 years of a dead man's stubbornness becoming a living man's burden. Nobody, Everett thought, turning the whistle slowly between his fingers, nobody who knew what $4.11 felt like in a coat pocket at the end of a bad week would blame him for taking it. He thought about signing. He let himself sit with the thought longer than he was proud of afterward, long enough to picture the exact motion of a pen crossing a page, long enough to imagine driving away from this hillside and never looking at a burned foundation again. Duke, who had been lying quiet against the van's rear doors, rose without being called and climbed up onto the mattress platform beside him, turned once, and lay back down with his skull resting directly on the whistle in Everett's open palm. Not accidental. Everett was certain of that even then. The same deliberate weight the dog had placed against his knee 100 times before, in 100 smaller moments exactly like this one. Everett looked down at him for a long time in the dark. He'd have wanted me to take the money, he said quietly, to the dial, to the whistle, to no one at all, and any sane man would say so. Duke didn't lift his head. His eyes, open, amber, even in the dim light through the windshield, simply held Everett's, patient and unimpressed. The exact look Everett imagined his uncle must have worn 100 times at the edge of that same training field, waiting for a dog to decide on its own to trust the sound calling it back. He closed his hand around the whistle and did not open it again until morning. At first light, before he called Diane, Everett did the thing 11 years of Army training had built into him below the level of conscious decision. He walked the perimeter again, slower this time, through the gray hour before sunrise, looking for anything that had not been there the day before. He found it on the second pass, 40 yards past the tree line above the county road, angled to catch anyone approaching the gate from either direction. A trail camera, camouflage wrapped, bolted at chest height to a young oak, its lens facing directly down the access road toward the camp. The memory card slot was empty. Whoever placed it had either not yet retrieved footage or had already come back once to collect it. But the mounting bracket was new, the screws bright and unweathered, and a faint boot print in the soft mud beneath the tree was a size and tread pattern that matched nothing Everett, Wade, Diane, or Frank had left on the property in the past week. Duke found the second one 20 minutes later, a smaller unit tucked into a hollow stump near the burned foundation itself, close enough to have caught, had its cards still been inside. Every hour, the five of them had spent hauling bins up out of the vault. Everett photographed both devices in place, called Diane, and followed her instruction not to touch either one until Sheriff Boyd Tillery had been notified. A deputy arrived, logged the serial numbers, photographed the mounting points, and collected the empty units. There was no card, no identifiable print, and no legal basis for Tillery to station a patrol car indefinitely on 600 acres, merely because unknown people had mounted cameras on private land. He promised extra passes on the county road. Everett heard the limitation in his voice and did not mistake it for protection. Everett stood between the two fresh mounting sites for a long time in the near dark, the whistle a small, hard weight against his chest under his shirt, and understood with the particular flat certainty of a man who had spent years learning to trust his instincts in worse places than this one, that someone had been watching them work from the very first day, patient, careful, waiting to see exactly how much they'd found before deciding what to do about it. Diane Marsh returned that evening after filing copies of the deputy's report in 2 jurisdictions, and by the time she arrived, Frank Okafor had already spread 3 documents across the tailgate, old subcontractor filings pulled from a public records request he'd submitted the day the vault opened, filings that listed, buried in a footnote 3 pages deep, a predecessor entity called Ridgeline Tactical Supply, later absorbed into Vantage Defense Solutions in a corporate restructuring 18 years ago. Ridgeline Tactical Supply is who's named as the equipment vendor in Harlan's training logs, Frank said. Not Vantage, not yet, not back then, but the ownership chain runs straight through. Same registered agent, same original incorporation address, same family name on the founding paperwork. Marcus Vantage's father started Ridgeline. Marcus folded it into Vantage Defense Solutions 11 years after the fire, once the statute of limitations on most of what mattered had already run out. Convenient timing, Diane said. Legally, Frank said, convenient timing isn't a crime. But a documented pattern of equipment failure, a written objection from the site commander, a fire, a death, an incident report that omits the equipment history entirely, and a corporate restructuring that happens to bury the responsible entity's name 11 years later. A good prosecutor could make a great deal out of that pattern, Sergeant Cole, if it ever reaches a prosecutor. Diane was already drafting the sealed notice she'd promised, a formal filing establishing on the record with the county court that potential evidence of a concealed fatal equipment failure and a subsequent cover-up had been discovered on the Ashwood property, without disclosing its full contents publicly. A legal tripwire meant to make sure that whatever happened to Everett Cole or the vault itself in the days ahead, there would be an official record that it had existed. If they have friends at the courthouse, she said, sealing the envelope, that's exactly why I'm not sending it only there. The hidden cameras changed the way the group handled the site. Diane made duplicate inventories of every surviving document. Frank photographed each bin before and after anyone touched it. The most important pages were scanned, photographed, and copied into fire-resistant cases above ground, while the originals remained in the vault until law enforcement could formally accept custody without breaking the record of where they had been found. Wade repaired the gate chain and added lights powered by his generator. None of them believed those measures made the camp safe. They were simply in agreement that no single fire, friendly clerk, or missing memory card would be allowed to erase the whole truth again. Grace Lou, meanwhile, had spent 2 days on the phone in the cab of Wade's truck, the only reliable signal on the property, working her way through genealogy databases and a network of contacts built over 15 years of this exact kind of work. By the 4th call, she had confirmed what the training logs already suggested. Daniel Reyes had grown up in Bakersfield, California, the only son of a widowed mother who had died 11 years ago after sending annual records requests to the Army and Veterans Affairs for more than a decade. On every copy she kept, she wrote the same words in the margin: cause unresolved. The Army had confirmed only that Daniel died in a training incident. It had never told her how, why, or who had decided that no further explanation was necessary. There's a sister, Grace said quietly, closing her notebook. Younger. Camila Reyes. Still in Bakersfield, as far as I can tell. I haven't called her yet. I want to be sure before I do that. I don't get a second chance to tell a family something like this the right way. It was the night after that call, more than a week after Everett had first parked in the gravel lot, Nora Keene's gray sedan still parked infuriatingly on the county road shoulder each time he checked, that everything went wrong at once. After the hidden cameras and Marcus Vantage's deadline, nobody had agreed to leave Everett alone. Wade slept in his truck 200 yards from the vault. Frank took a cot in the maintenance shed, and Diane used the least damaged office in the administration building. They hung simple noise alarms at the main gate in the two nearest fence gaps. The men who came that night avoided all three and entered through the wooded north boundary Everett had marked on his first perimeter walk. He woke to Duke barking, not the low warning growl from before, but a full, urgent alarm bark. Teeth bared, body rigid at the van's rear doors, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, the smell of smoke. Everett was out of the van in under 10 seconds, and what he saw stopped his breath in his chest. An orange glow pulsing from the mouth of the vault hatch, flame licking up out of the darkness below, where the bins of Harlan's training logs in the steel filing cabinet sat. 22 years of buried truth and about to become 20 seconds of ash. He did not think. That was the trouble with training. It didn't ask permission. It simply took the wheel. The same old operational calm rising up in him that had carried him through 3 deployments and had also, he would understand only later, very nearly gotten him killed twice before for exactly this reason, because it did not know how to hesitate, even when hesitation would have been the wiser animal. He went down the ladder into smoke, thickening by the second, grabbed the nearest 2 bins, the ones with Daniel Reyes's name on them, the ones that mattered most, and turned to go back up. Boots scraped gravel above him. Duke gave one savage bark toward the tree line, but Everett coughed out the dog's name from below, and Duke wheeled back toward the hatch. A hand seized the lifting ring. The steel lid slammed down, chain rasped through the ring and the concrete anchor, and a new padlock snapped shut outside. An engine turned over beyond the trees. None of it was wind. None of it was an accident. Whoever had lit the fire had waited for Everett to enter before sealing him inside with the smoke and 22 years of buried air. He hit the ladder hard enough to bruise his shoulder against the sealed hatch above him, and it did not move. The smoke thickened. Somewhere in the dark behind him, a bin of paper caught fully, and the light strengthened, orange and hungry. And Everett Cole, 46 years old, a Purple Heart packed in a box he had not opened in years, and a scar down his left leg that had never fully stopped aching, felt the walls of the vault do the thing they had done to the inside of an overturned vehicle in a country 6,000 miles from here. Years ago, when water had risen past his chest and a young Malinois named Cash had gone under it and not come back up. His hands found the ladder rungs and could not make them work. His breath came in short, useless pulls that filled nothing. The lantern on the workbench had gone out somewhere in the smoke and dark, and for one long, terrible stretch of seconds, Everett Cole was not in a concrete vault in the Virginia foothills at all. He was in the water, in the dark, with the sound of static in his ear, and a hand slipping out of his grip that he had never once, in 6 years, managed to stop reaching for in his sleep. It came back the way it always did, whole and immediate and indifferent into the years between then and now. The vehicle's cabin folded wrong around him, upside down in a way his body refused to accept even as his hands understood it perfectly. Water climbing black and cold from a ruptured line somewhere behind his seat, rising past his boots, his knees, his waist, while a voice on a dead radio kept repeating a call sign into static that would never answer. Cash had been in the rear compartment, harnessed, and Everett remembered. He would always remember. It was the one memory that never dulled no matter how many years he stacked on top of it. The exact sound the young Malinois had made when the water reached his muzzle, a sound that was not quite a bark and not quite anything else Everett had a word for, cut off mid-breath, and then nothing. And then 11 more minutes of nothing, of Everett's own hands scrabbling uselessly at a harness buckle gone rigid with panic and cold, before other hands finally reached down through the wreckage and pulled him, only him, out into air. He had never told anyone the full 11 minutes. Not the Army psychiatrist who'd cleared him for a third deployment 2 months later against his own better judgment. Not the two women he'd tried, briefly and badly, to build something with in the years since. Not Duke, not in words, though some nights he suspected the dog understood more of it than anyone he had ever tried to say it to out loud. Above him, muffled through 2 feet of concrete and a sealed steel hatch, he heard Duke, not barking, screaming, the raw, desperate sound of a dog throwing his entire 60 pounds against an immovable door over and over, claws tearing at metal that could not be torn, and something in that sound, animal and total, and refusing every law of the situation that said this hatch does not open, reached down into the water in the static and the dark where Everett had gone and pulled, hard, the way Duke had learned to pull him back from 100 smaller versions of this exact place. "Not there," Everett said aloud, his own voice a stranger's rasp in the smoke. "Not now." He forced his hand to close around the ladder rung. He forced his lungs to take one breath, then another, counting them the way he'd been trained to count seconds underwater when panic wanted the numbers more than air did. On the third breath, through the ringing in his ears, he heard Wade Higgins bellowing, Diane shouting into a phone that a man was trapped underground, and bolt cutters striking the new chain once, twice, then a third time. Metal parted, light, hard, blinding, wonderful light, broke across the ladder as Wade wrenched the hatch open and he and Diane hauled Everett up by the collar of his jacket with a strength that belied both their ages. He came up coughing so hard his vision blurred. The two bins still clutched against his chest, and Duke hit him before his knees had even found the ground, forehead driving into his sternum, hard enough to nearly knock him flat, a full body press of 60 pounds of dog that did not stop shaking for a long time. "I heard you," Everett rasped into the fur at Duke's neck. "I heard you." Behind them, Wade was already dragging a garden hose from the maintenance shed toward the hatch, and Frank was on his knees at the vault's edge coughing smoke out of his own lungs, having gone down partway himself before the fire drove him back. And it took the better part of 40 minutes and every bucket, hose, and extinguisher on the property to beat the fire down to nothing. And by the time it was out, roughly a third of the bins in the vault, including they would discover the following morning the original incident report and 2 of Harlan's earliest training logs, were ash. "Somebody knew exactly which building to hit and exactly which door to shut," Diane said grimly, standing at the hatch's edge in the gray pre-dawn light, the smell of wet ash hanging over everything. "This wasn't kids. This wasn't random." The volunteer ambulance arrived while the last thin ribbons of smoke were still rising into the pale sky. Everett tried to refuse transport until the medic clipped a pulse oximeter to his finger, watched the number fall, and told him that men who survived smoke sometimes died later because pride had delayed oxygen. He spent 6 hours at Bath Community Hospital under observation for smoke inhalation. No airway burn appeared, and the carbon monoxide level came down with treatment, but the physician made him promise to return if the cough worsened. Wade followed the ambulance with Duke in the truck. The dog waited at the emergency entrance, refused every biscuit offered by 3 separate nurses, and did not settle until Everett walked back out. By early afternoon, Everett was sitting on the camp's tailgate with an EMS blanket around his shoulders, coughing occasionally into his fist and watching forensic deputies photograph the blackened hatch. His hands had mostly stopped shaking. Duke still would not leave his side, not even to drink from the water bowl Wade placed 6 inches from his paws, choosing instead to keep his skull pressed against Everett's knee with the stubbornness of a pawn who had decided that his job for the foreseeable future was simply proximity. "You went in for 2 bins of paper," Frank said quietly, sitting down heavily beside him, his own face streaked gray with soot. "I need you to understand something, Sergeant Cole, and I need you to actually hear it instead of just nodding at me the way soldiers do when a superior officer's telling them something they've already decided not to believe. Whatever's in those bins matters. It matters enormously. But it is not worth your life, and if it ever comes down to that choice again, I would rather lose every page in that vault than watch that hatch swing shut with you underneath it a second time." Everett didn't answer right away. He looked down at Duke instead, at the bent ear, at the eyes that hadn't stopped tracking his face since the hatch came open. Wasn't planning on making a habit of it. he said finally, and it was as close to a promise as either of them was going to get out of him that morning. Wade held up the cut length of chain he'd found looped through the hatch's exterior latch. A padlock, new, cheap, hardware store bright against the vault's rusted old fixtures, still hanging from it. Somebody brought their own lock, he said. Planned to seal that hatch shut and let the fire finish what the lock started. Whoever it was didn't figure on you getting them bins out before it caught full, and didn't figure on this dog raising Cain loud enough to wake me 200 yards off in my truck. Everett looked toward the county road. Nora Keene's gray sedan was gone from the shoulder for the first time in 2 days. Duke saw him look. Duke's ears went flat, and a low sound built in his chest, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Everett found himself agreeing completely with his dog's judgment, even though some old, careful part of him, the part that had learned the hard way, a lifetime ago on a hillside in a country he tried not to think about, that the obvious answer was not always the true one, wasn't quite ready to let himself believe it yet. He was right not to be ready. Nora Keene's sedan reappeared at the gate 2 hours later, and this time she did not wait to be invited. She got out fast, a laptop bag over one shoulder, and an expression on her face that had none of the careful, patient distance she'd worn every day before. And Duke, extraordinarily, did not move to block her. He watched her, ears up, tense. But he let her come. "I know you don't trust me," she said breathless, before Everett could speak. The directional recorder and low-light camera I showed Diane were still running on the public ridge. At 3:11 this morning, the motion sensor woke both units. The camera lost the men behind the tree line, but it caught the rental van entering without headlights and leaving 11 minutes later. The recorder's parabolic housing was aimed at the vault approach. It caught 2 voices, the chain, the lock, and Duke when he started throwing himself against the door. I drove until I found stable broadband, made 3 encrypted copies on my own drives, uploaded one to my attorney and one to my editor, and preserved the original cards without opening them again before I came back here. She opened the laptop. "You need to hear the voices, and Sheriff Tillery needs the original memory cards before anyone knows I have them." The recording was rough and wind-scraped, but its timestamps matched Nora's camera and the county road traffic sensor Diane later obtained. Frank filtered the worst of the noise without altering the original file, while Diane wrote down every step and sealed the memory cards in separate evidence envelopes. Beneath the wind were 2 male voices at the hatch, one younger and tight with nerves, the other controlled enough to make Everett's jaw lock. "The files are burning, Preston. Why are we still here?" "Because Cole will go down for them. When he does, we shut it and lock it. My uncle wants this gone, not gone and still provable. That's not evidence anymore. That's a man. You want it in. Don't go soft now. When the dog starts, move." "That's him," Everett said quietly. "Preston Vantage." Marcus Vantage himself came to the camp only once the following morning, before the sheriff's department had made any arrest. A marked cruiser was parked beside the administration building, Diane recorded from inside the gate, and Marcus remained on the public side of the chain. He arrived alone in a dark sedan with none of his nephew's tactical casual pretense. A tailored gray suit, a wristwatch that cost more than Everett's truck, and the unhurried gait of a man who had never once in his adult life walked into a room expecting to lose. He stopped at the gate rather than approach the vault, as though some old instinct told him the ground closer in belonged. Now to people he could no longer outmaneuver, and Duke met him there with a stillness far more unsettling than any bark. Planted directly between Everett and the older man, unmoving, unblinking, the low growl building steady in his chest the entire time Marcus Vantage spoke. "I want to be direct with you, Mr. Cole, because I think you're a direct man, and I respect that," Marcus said, hands folded in front of him, voice pitched at the same unhurried register it had held on the phone, though something underneath it now had gone brittle, in a way phone calls hadn't let Everett hear. "Whatever my nephew did, he did without my authorization. I want that understood clearly, before lawyers make it complicated. But I also want you to understand what you're about to unmake, if you keep pulling this thread. Vantage Defense Solutions employs 1,100 people across 4 states. Warehouse workers, logistics drivers, machinists, families who have nothing to do with a fire that happened before most of them were hired. You'll be very righteous, Mr. Cole, standing on this hill with your and your dead uncle's paperwork. I hope it's worth what it cost people who never made a single decision about Camp Ashwood in their lives. Funny thing about decisions, Everett said. Somebody made one 22 years ago to keep running a drill with equipment your own site rep knew was failing because stopping cost money. I didn't make your company employ 1,100 people on top of that decision. You did. Something moved behind Marcus Vantage's eyes then, brief and cold, gone before it fully surfaced. My father built this company believing the country needed men willing to do unglamorous, thankless work reliably, at scale, without sentiment slowing down the schedule, he said. I have spent 30 years honoring that. I am not going to apologize to you for running a business the way it has always been run in this industry. Your father's dead, Everett said. Mine's not much better off. Doesn't mean either one of them gets to keep deciding whether Daniel Reyes's sister ever gets told the truth about her brother. Marcus Vantage looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time since he'd stepped out of the sedan, something like genuine uncertainty crossed his face. Not guilt, Everett would think later, turning the moment over. Something closer to surprise that the calculation he had run 1,000 times in 1,000 boardrooms. The one where money and patience and the law's slow grinding gears always eventually favored the man with more of all three, had for once arrived at an answer he didn't like. You'll regret not taking the $2 million, he said finally, and there was no warmth left in it at all now. None of the performed courtesy from the phone call. Not because I'll do anything to you, Mr. Cole. I won't need to. The world does that work for men like me eventually, all on its own. He got back in the sedan without waiting for a response, and Duke did not stop watching the car until it had disappeared around the bend in the county road, and did not fully relax, Everett noticed. For the better part of an hour afterward, the same slow-release tension Everett recognized from his own chest. The particular exhaustion of having stood, without flinching, in front of something that could genuinely have hurt him and chosen not to look away first. I've been building a file on Vantage Defense Solutions contract violations for 2 years, Nora said. Nobody would run it. Too much legal risk, too much money on the other side buying silence with lawyers instead of bullets. When I heard something had surfaced at the old Ashwood site, I came because I thought it might finally be enough to force somebody's hand. I should have introduced myself better. I know how it looked sitting out there like that. I've had 2 sources go dark on this story already, and I wasn't going to make a third mistake by announcing myself to people I hadn't verified yet either. Diane Marsh was already on the phone with the county sheriff's office by the time Nora finished talking. Nora's low-light camera had captured enough of the rental van's plate for Tillery to request the rental record, and the company returned a name before sunset. Nolan Price, an operations supervisor for a private security contractor Vantage Defense Solutions had used for site work twice before, both times during contract disputes that had quietly disappeared. Price's phone had connected to a tower covering the Ashwood Road during the 11-minute window, and the tread on boots visible in a photograph from his company profile matched the print Everett had found beneath the hidden trail camera. It did not yet identify the second voice by itself, but the combined evidence was enough for Tillery to seek warrants instead of asking polite questions. The county sheriff, a broad, unhurried man named Sheriff Boyd Tillery, who had grown up 2 towns over from where Wade Higgins was born, and clearly trusted Wade's judgment more than he trusted most things that arrived from outside the county line, drove out himself that afternoon, listened to the recording twice, examined the cut chain and the cheap new padlock, and made a phone call of his own that put a marked unit on the road watching the turnoff to the Vantage family's regional office by nightfall. Preston Vantage was not arrested in a blaze of sirens. There was no chase, no dramatic standoff at the gate. He was taken into custody 2 days later, quietly, standing beside a rental car at a gas station 40 miles from the camp, with a duffel bag in the back seat and a one-way plane ticket open on his phone. The arresting deputy later noting in his report that Vantage's only comment on being read his rights was that his uncle had told him this would never actually come to anything. Nolan Price was arrested the same afternoon after the rental record, phone location warrant, and Nora's audio placed him at Ashwood. Faced with a recording of his own voice objecting that the trap was no longer merely evidence tampering, he began cooperating before midnight. Price said Preston had recruited him to burn the vault and had ordered him to wait until Everett went below before closing the hatch. He also said Preston claimed Marcus Vantage had demanded that the records disappear. But Price had never spoken directly to Marcus and could not prove Marcus knew Preston intended to leave a man inside. That distinction would matter to prosecutors later. It did not make the chain around the hatch any less deliberate. Sheriff Tillery drove out to the camp himself that evening to tell Everett in person rather than by phone, parking his cruiser at an angle that suggested a man who'd been driving these hills long enough to stop caring how straight he left it, and stood in the gravel lot turning his hat over once in his hands before he spoke. The way Everett had noticed a certain kind of older lawman always did before delivering news they considered significant. "Wanted you to hear it from me and not the radio scanner," Tillery said. "We've got both men on arson and evidence tampering, and Preston is being held while the DA looks hard at attempted murder. Once she's finished reading Frank's timeline of exactly how close that hatch came to being your coffin, son. County's never had a case land on my desk quite like this one. I've been sheriff 11 years. Mostly it's stolen livestock and Friday night foolishness at the Pruitt place." He set the hat back on his head. "Your uncle would have been proud of what you dug up here. I only met Harlan Cole a handful of times, but I remember every one of them, and I remember thinking he was carrying something heavier than a man ought to carry alone. Glad somebody finally helped him set it down." "It won't be enough to convict Marcus outright," Diane told Everett, sitting on the tailgate of his truck a week after Preston's arrest, watching the last of the fire damage being photographed by a county forensic technician for the ongoing investigation. "Men like that build fireproof rooms around themselves their whole lives, brick by brick, favor by favor. But it's enough to make every future contract, every future partnership, every future dollar cost him more than it used to. Sometimes that's the only kind of justice a case like this ever actually gets. Not enough, but not nothing." The Federal Contracting Oversight Office opened its own inquiry 11 days after Preston Vantage's arraignment. Once Nora Keene's story, 19 months in the making, delayed by 3 separate outlets that had judged it too legally dangerous to run, finally cleared final review and published under a headline that named Vantage Defense Solutions directly for the first time in any public forum. The lead investigator assigned to the case, a soft-spoken federal auditor named Renata Ibsen, who had spent a career combing through defense contracts most people never knew existed, called Diane Marsh personally within 48 hours of the story going live. "I want to be honest with you about the scope of what we're looking at," Ibsen told Diane on a call Everett heard from across the tailgate. "We are not auditing 22-year-old harnesses still sitting in kennels. We are tracing the release mechanism through every successor model the predecessor company supplied after Ashwood. 4 other sites received later generations built from the same engineering drawings. 3 are operational today. If the binding geometry was never redesigned, the danger did not expire when the first batch was retired." A pause. Mr. Cole's dog may have uncovered a defect that survived because the report that should have triggered redesign was buried. "It rarely comes to anything for men like that," Diane said, when she heard standing in the gravel lot with the sealed evidence bins finally, formally in Sheriff Tillery's custody for cataloging. "Until every once in a while it does. Marcus Vantage did not fall the way his nephew did. There was no arrest, no gas station duffel bag, no confession. He issued a statement through counsel expressing shock and sympathy for an isolated incident involving a family member acting entirely outside company policy, offered a substantial reward for information regarding the fire, and hired a public relations firm within 48 hours. 3 secondary outlets softened their headlines after receiving legal letters, and 2 removed Marcus's name from their summaries while leaving the underlying reporting intact. He did not deny knowledge of the Ashwood fire. He simply declined, through 3 consecutive attorneys, to answer any question about it directly. But the evidence did not need him to answer. Frank Okafor's records request had already surfaced the Ridgeline Tactical Supply paper trail, and Grace Liu's confirmation of Daniel Reyes's identity gave the story a name and a face that no press release could soften. And Diane Marsh's sealed courthouse filing, sent deliberately to 2 separate jurisdictions the same week it was filed, exactly so no single friendly clerk could make it disappear, created a legal record that a federal contracting oversight office, once alerted by a very long, very careful piece of investigative reporting that Nora Keene finally, after 2 years of trying, found an outlet willing to run, could not ignore. Vantage Defense Solutions' active government harness and tether contracts were suspended, pending a safety review within 3 weeks. 2 facilities in other states came forward with failure reports that had been logged as handler error and closed without design inspection. The company's planned public offering was quietly shelved. Marcus Vantage remained, for the time being, a free man, but his name no longer opened every door. That was how accountability sometimes began in cases built to resist handcuffs. Not with a confession, but with contracts that stopped renewing, calls that stopped being returned, and a reputation that could no longer purchase automatic belief. Preston Vantage, facing charges that now included arson, evidence tampering, and attempted murder, gave a partial statement through his own attorney 3 weeks later. Not out of conscience, Diane suspected, but because a reduced sentence was worth more to him than his uncle's approval once his uncle had stopped returning his calls. The statement confirmed what the recording had already made clear. He had acted on his uncle's direct instruction, though Marcus Vantage's attorneys immediately characterized that claim as an attempt by a desperate young man to minimize his own culpability. Everett sat with Duke's head heavy against his knee, the whistle, retrieved unburned from his jacket pocket, where he had carried it every day since the vault first opened, turning slowly between his fingers, and thought that he understood, finally, something about his uncle he hadn't understood, standing in a strip mall parking lot with a letter in his hand weeks earlier. Harlan Cole had not spent 22 years and every dollar he had protecting a piece of land. He had spent it guarding a door, waiting for someone patient enough, or stubborn enough, or simply present enough to finally walk through it and finish what he never could. Grace Liu called Camilla Reyes on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, 4 days after Preston Vantage's arrest, before Nora's article named Daniel or any outlet could approach the family, sitting in the cab of Wade Higgins's truck because it was still the only reliable signal on the property. And Everett stood 20 feet away with Duke pressed against his leg, not listening on purpose, listening anyway, because there are some conversations a man cannot help but hear the shape of, even when he cannot make out the words. Grace made the call from the front seat of Wade's truck, notebook open on her knee, the same careful preparation she brought to every one of these conversations after 15 years of learning. The hard way, how easily they could go wrong if rushed. She had learned to lead with the plainest facts first, a name, a rank, a unit, a date, before anything softer, because grief delivered too gently sometimes read to families who had waited decades as evasion. Ms. Reyes, I apologize. I have you listed as unmarried in the most recent record I could find. My name is Grace Liu. I work with families of service members whose official records were incomplete or in error. I'm calling about your brother, Daniel. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that Grace glanced at Everett, standing 20 feet off with Duke, and gave a small shake of her head that meant, not yet, don't come closer. Let her have this first moment alone. Nobody from the government has called our family about Danny in 11 years, Camilla's voice said finally, thin and careful, as though testing whether the sentence itself might break something. The last time was somebody from Veterans Affairs telling my mother, 2 months before she died, that there was nothing further to add to the file. She hung up on them. She never really came back from that call, if I'm honest. I think some part of her had been holding out for one more answer, and when the Army told her there wasn't one, she just stopped. I have an answer, Grace said gently. It's not an easy one, but it's a true one, and I think you and your mother both deserve to have it a long time ago. She told her then the training logs, the denied equipment recall, the fire, the vault, 22 years of a stranger's stubbornness keeping the truth from disappearing entirely. Camilla Reyes was quiet through most of it, asking only a handful of questions, her voice growing steadier rather than more fragile as the call went on, until near the end she asked the one question Grace had learned over the years that almost every family eventually asked, in one form or another. Was he scared? Camilla said. At the end, I've imagined it 1,000 different ways and I never know which one to believe. Grace looked down at the training log open on her own knee, at Harlan's cramped, careful hand describing a young handler who'd volunteered to run a drill himself rather than let anyone junior take the risk. I think he was more worried about his dog than about himself, Grace said honestly. That's what the record shows. He went back in for Cato. I can't tell you he wasn't afraid. But I can tell you what kind of man he was in the last decision anybody ever recorded him making. And it wasn't the decision of a man thinking about himself. Camilla Reyes flew out from Bakersfield 11 days later. She was 39 years old, sharp-eyed with her brother's photograph, one of the few the family still had, a stiff formal portrait from basic training, young and unsmiling in a way that didn't match anything Harlan's logs had written about him, laminated and carried in her wallet the way some people carry a saint's card. She brought her own two children, a boy of 12 and a girl of 9, both of whom had grown up knowing only that an uncle they'd never met had died doing something for the Army a long time ago, a sentence so thin it had never once satisfied either of them. My mother died still sending letters with his name at the top, Camilla said, standing at the edge of the scorched foundation where Kennel Block C had once stood. Duke sitting calm and steady at her side without being asked, having decided the moment she arrived that she belonged there in a way he had never extended to Nora Keene in her first uncertain days. She used to say the Army owed her a sentence. Just one. What happened to my son? She never got it. She died not knowing if he'd been brave or careless or unlucky or all three. He was brave, Everett said, and found that his voice held steady saying it, which surprised him. He went back in for his dog. My uncle's log says Danny had better instincts than most officers he'd served under. That's not a small thing for Harlan Cole to write about a 26-year-old 2 years into his enlistment. Camilla Reyes cried then, standing on ground still faintly gray with old ash, and her daughter took her hand without being told to, and Duke leaned his full weight against the woman's leg exactly the way he leaned against Everett on the nights the past came back too loud to argue with. And nobody in the small gathered group of people, Everett, Wade, Frank, Diane, Grace, and Nora Keene, who had stayed in the end and earned every inch of the trust Duke had eventually extended her, said anything at all for a long while, because some silences do more work than any sentence could. Nora Keene's first story, published 11 days after Preston's arraignment, only after Grace confirmed that Camilla had been told the truth, and Camilla agreed that Daniel's name should no longer be hidden. The article ran in a mid-sized investigative outlet, willing to absorb legal risks that larger organizations had avoided for 2 years. Over the following month, it was picked up, expanded, and syndicated by 3 national papers. For the first time, the public record connected Daniel Reyes, Camp Ashwood, the defective release mechanism, and the corporate lineage from Ridgeline Tactical Supply to Vantage Defense Solutions in one account that could not be quietly separated into harmless pieces. The county, faced with a legal record no longer easy to dismiss in a national news story gaining traction by the week, dropped its condemnation proceedings against the Ashwood property entirely, and instead, at Diane Marsh's urging, granted it protected historical site status, which meant the county would help fund basic stabilization of the surviving buildings rather than continuing to try to seize and auction land nobody but Everett Cole had ever wanted enough to fight for. It took the rest of that autumn and most of the following spring to do it properly. Frank Okafor coordinated with the Department of Defense's Casualty Affairs Office to formally correct Daniel Reyes's record from training incident, cause administratively closed, to killed in the line of duty, contributing equipment failure documented. The correction triggered a formal review of unpaid benefits and, months later, a compensation award to Daniel's estate, an acknowledgement his mother had fought to obtain for 11 years and had not lived to see. Priya Anand, the second handler burned pulling dogs clear that night, was located by Grace Liu through a different quiet network entirely. Living 2 states away, still carrying scar tissue down one forearm, she had stopped trying to hide years ago, and traveled to Ashwood herself the following spring to stand at the foundation and finally say, out loud, in front of people who believed her, what she had been made to sign away the right to say 22 years earlier. Local stonemasons built the memorial wall that spring, setting each dark field stone by hand along the low rise above the old Kennel Block foundation, facing east toward the ridgeline, and Grace Liu chose the names to be carved only after each family had been contacted, consulted, and given the chance to decide for themselves whether they were ready. Because, as she told Everett more than once during that long winter of quiet phone calls in careful letters, absence was sometimes its own kind of answer, and not every wound in every family was ready for open air at the same time. Two names went onto the stone that first spring, Daniel Reyes, and beneath his carved slightly smaller, at Camilla's specific request, Cato, because her brother, she said, would never have forgiven anyone who left his partner's name off a wall built in his honor. Priya Anand came the week after the stone was set, driving the 6 hours from her home 2 states away alone, in a sedan, and unassuming as she turned out to be in person. A compact, sharp-eyed woman in her late 40s who moved with the careful economy of someone long practiced at not drawing attention to a body that had cost her more than most strangers ever needed to know. She stood at the wall for a long time before she said anything, one hand resting lightly against the stone, tracing Daniel Reyes' name with 2 fingers the way Camilla had, though her grief, when it came, arrived quieter, more contained, worn down by 2 decades into something closer to a permanent weather than a storm. I used to imagine coming back here, she told Everett, sitting afterward on an overturned crate beside the stabilized foundation. Duke settled at her feet with his chin on her boot, as though he'd known her his whole life rather than an hour. For years, I'd picture driving up this road and standing right where I'm standing now and saying something. I never had the words for what I wanted to say, and I never had the nerve to make the drive, because the last time I stood on this ground, it nearly killed me, and the paperwork I signed afterward made it very clear that coming back and talking about it wasn't a door anyone wanted me to walk back through. She looked at the scars still visible along her forearm, faded now to pale ridges she no longer bothered covering. Harlan used to write to me every year on the anniversary, never asked me to say anything publicly, just wanted me to know somebody remembered it the way it actually happened. I have every one of those letters, 22 of them. Can I read them sometime? Grace Lou asked gently, from where she stood a respectful distance off. Not to publish, just to understand the whole shape of what he was carrying. I think it would help the record. Priya Anand nodded slowly. I think he'd have wanted that, she said. He was tired of being the only one who remembered right. Priya asked that her name be added the following spring, once she felt ready, not to mark a death, but to honor a survival the record had tried for 22 years to erase into something smaller and more convenient than the truth. In early autumn, several months after the first stones were set, Everett stood beside the finished wall on the day of its small, unadorned dedication. No stage, no banners, no cameras beyond Nora Keene's, who had asked permission first and been given it, wearing a plain gray button shirt and the boots he'd cleaned the night before out of some instinct he couldn't fully name. The old silver whistle in his closed hand, Duke sitting at his side with his muzzle lifted toward the ridge in the low autumn light. My uncle kept this land, Everett said, when Diane nodded that it was time, his voice rough but steady in a way it rarely was around more than one person at once. I used to think keeping something meant owning it outright, holding on to it because it was yours and nobody else's business. I don't think that anymore. I think sometimes keeping a place just means standing guard over it until the people it actually belongs to are finally ready to come find their way back. He looked at the 2 names on the stone and passed them, briefly, to the empty space beside them where a third name, Priya Anand's, at her own quiet request, honoring not a death but a survival that had cost her nearly everything anyway, would be added the following year, once she felt ready to see it carved permanent instead of merely spoken aloud. This ground doesn't belong to me, he said. It never really did. It belongs to a promise my uncle made and couldn't keep by himself, and to a young handler who went back in for his dog when nobody would have blamed him for running, and to every family that had spent 22 years being told that there was nothing left to ask about. He looked down at Duke. And it belongs to this dog who found a door under a foundation nobody else thought to look under, and who pulled me back out of a fire I might not have made it out of alone. Wade, standing near the back of the small crowd with his unlit cigar still clamped between his teeth even for the occasion, muttered something that might have been best eulogy I've heard since Ronnie Pruitt's barn dance, and a few people who'd known him long enough to expect exactly that kind of interruption laughed. Softly, the sound cutting the grief just enough to let it breathe rather than choke. Camilla Reyes spoke next, her 2 children standing close on either side of her, the boy holding a small American flag he'd insisted on bringing, though nobody had told him to. She read haltingly from a page she'd written on the plane out, about a brother she had known at 17 but now carried most vividly in fragments. The sound of his laugh, a specific blue jacket, the way he used to let her win at cards, though she had not understood until years later that he was letting her. And about a mother who had spent 11 years sending letters and records requests because admitting there was truly nothing left to learn had been unbearable. My mother used to say hope was the cruelest gift the army ever gave her, Camilla said, her voice steadying as she went, the way grief sometimes does when it finally has somewhere honest to land. Not knowing kept a door open she couldn't walk through and couldn't close either. I used to be angry at Danny for that. I'm not anymore. I understand now he never had a choice in what happened to him. The only people who had a choice were the ones who decided a delivery schedule mattered more than telling my mother the truth. She looked at the stone. So today isn't just for you, Danny. It's for her, too. She should have gotten to stand here. I'm standing here for both of us. Grace Lou spoke last among the family representatives, brief and unadorned. Reading the full text of the accident index entry that had once reduced Daniel Reyes's death to a single redacted line, followed immediately by the corrected record the Department of Defense had finally issued. His name, his rank, his unit, the true cause, stated plainly, without euphemism, for what she said was, as far as her research could determine, the first time in 22 years. I do this work because paperwork has a terrible habit of outliving the people who wrote it, long after everyone involved has seen it or moved on or simply stopped caring enough to correct it, Grace said, closing her notebook. Somebody has to go back and fix what it got wrong, even 22 years later, especially 22 years later. It doesn't undo anything, but it matters that the record finally agrees with what actually happened. Sheriff Tillery attended in his dress uniform rather than his patrol gear, standing at respectful attention near the back with his hat over his heart for the duration, and afterwards shook Everett's hand with the particular firmness of a man who considered a handshake a form of testimony. Diane Marsh stood beside Frank Okafor the entire ceremony, and Everett noticed, without remarking on it, that at some point during Camilla's reading, Frank had reached over and taken Diane's hand, and neither of them had let go for the rest of the afternoon. A small, quiet thing blooming out of a hard season, the kind of thing Everett suspected his uncle, watching from wherever stubborn old trainers ended up, would have approved of without ever saying so directly. Later that autumn, several weeks after the dedication, a television news magazine sent a crew to Camp Ashwood to film the memorial wall against the ridgeline. The segment included interviews with Camila Reyes, Priya Anand, and, after considerable persuasion from Diane, who argued that the story needed his voice even though he hated the idea, a brief appearance by Everett Cole, sitting on the same tailgate where so much of the previous year had unfolded, Duke's head resting in his lap for the entire 6 minutes he spoke on camera. People keep asking me if I feel like a hero, Everett told the interviewer, when she asked the question everyone eventually asked. I dug up a hole my uncle already knew was there. I didn't do anything brave. I just finally showed up. He looked down at Duke. He's the one who found the door. I just decided not to walk away from it once he had. 3 weeks after the segment aired, a follow-up story broke. Nora had spent the autumn tracing the release mechanism through procurement drawings, successor model numbers, and 2 of the 3 facilities flagged in the Federal Review. Both had experienced unreported binding failures in later generation tether systems, none fatal, all recorded as handler error using language nearly identical to the Ashwood report. Vantage Defense Solutions issued an emergency recall covering every current model that inherited the disputed release geometry. It was the company's first voluntary action in the affair, though nobody mistook damage control for contrition. Everett received that winter a short formal letter from a facility 2 states away, a currently serving K9 handler, 24 years old, thanking him, in careful, slightly stiff language that read like someone writing something they meant more than the words quite managed to carry, for a recall that had replaced the exact model of tether harness she used every week with her own dog. She'd enclosed a photograph, herself and a young Belgian Malinois, both grinning in the particular unguarded way working dogs and their handlers sometimes did, standing in front of a kennel block that was, unmistakably, still standing, still in use, still safe. Everett kept that photograph tucked into the same footlocker that had once held only a whistle and a letter. He did not know the woman's name beyond the signature at the bottom of the page. He did not need to. He understood, looking at it some evenings when the camp had gone quiet and Duke had settled into the particular deep sleep of a man who'd worked hard and eaten well, that this, a stranger 2 states away, still breathing, still working, still whole, was the actual shape of what his uncle had spent 22 years and every dollar he had trying to buy with nothing but stubbornness and unpaid legal bills. Not vindication. Not even justice, exactly. Not the kind that came with handcuffs and headlines. Just this. One fewer harness that could fail. One more handler who came home at the end of a drill instead of not. By the following summer, Priya Anand's name had been added beneath Daniel's and Cato's, honoring the life that survived as deliberately as the wall honored the lives that did not. Everett Cole had moved fully into the old administration building at Camp Ashwood, its roof patched, its windows reglazed with county stabilization funds, and Wade Higgins's stubborn insistence on doing half the labor himself for free because somebody in this county ought to still know how to swing a hammer. The van sat parked permanently under the rebuilt carport now, more storage shed than home, though Everett kept the mattress in the back out of a sentiment he didn't examine too closely. Wade Higgins never really left in the end. He'd shown up that first week with a cutting torch and a favor 20 years overdue, and somewhere in the months that followed, he simply became a fixture of the place, first hauling debris and lumber for the stabilization work, then, once the county funds came through, unofficially supervising half the repair crew, because, as he put it, somebody's got to make sure these boys don't cut a corner Harlan Cole would have had my hide for. He took to eating dinner most nights at the newly repaired administration building's kitchen table, arguing with Everett over card games neither of them was particularly good at, and by the following spring it had started referring to Duke, without any apparent self-consciousness, as my granddog, a title Duke seemed to accept with the same gracious tolerance he extended to most of Wade's eccentricities, including the biscuits Wade still insisted every single time he hadn't brought. Nora Keene became a regular presence too, though a quieter one, driving out every few months to check in as the federal investigation widened. And somewhere in that first year, the wary distance Duke had held toward her thawed completely into something closer to enthusiasm. He took to meeting her card at the gate now, tail going, the same dog who had once refused to let her within 10 feet of the evidence bins now leaning his full weight against her legs the moment she stepped out. And Nora, for her part, admitted once over coffee that she'd never had a source's judgment matter to her quite as much as that dog's had, in 2 years of chasing a story nobody else would touch. He slept badly the first several months in a real bed under a real roof, waking some nights at 2 in the morning with his hands searching for a wall that wasn't there. The room too wide and too still after years of a van's closed, familiar dark. Duke, older now by the calendar, but no different in the particular attentiveness that had never once left him, would rise from his blanket on those nights and press his shoulder against Everett's ribs until the panic settled back down into something survivable. And Everett learned slowly, the way his uncle's letter had perhaps been trying to tell him all along, that healing was not a door a man walked through once and left behind. It was a tide. It came in some nights and covered everything he thought he had already made peace with. It went back out other nights and left the ground solid enough to stand on. Neither version of it was permanent, and neither version of it, he came to understand, was a failure. He kept Daniel Reyes's whistle on a cord around his neck. He knew the sound Duke had followed across the burned foundation was wind crossing a fractured vent, not a dead man calling from under the ground. What Everett had heard in the van 3 mornings earlier remained unresolved, and over time he stopped needing to resolve it. Harlan had preserved the whistle, the map, the corrosion, and the land around the hidden door so carefully that intention mattered more than explanation. Everett never mastered Harlan's low 2-note recall. He did not need to. His signal was a dog with a bent ear who leaned his weight into a grieving man's leg at exactly the right moment and had never once needed to be told when that moment arrived. He started, that second summer, teaching again. Nothing official, nothing the Army would have recognized, just a Saturday morning session here and there for a handful of local handlers and their dogs, word having spread through the county the way word spreads in places small enough that everyone eventually hears about everyone else's business, whether they mean to or not. He was not his uncle. He did not have Harlan's patience with beginners, nor his gift for making a nervous young dog feel, within minutes, that the whole world had slowed down just for him. But he had something else to offer, something that had cost him more than any training certificate ever could. He knew in his body, and not just in his head, exactly what it meant when a dog refused to leave a man's side, no matter how many times that man told him to go on without him. And he taught that lesson first, before any command, before any drill, because he had learned the hard way that it was the only one that actually mattered and when everything else fell apart. Duke, gray now around the muzzle in a way that still occasionally caught Everett off guard when the morning light hit it a certain way, slowed with the seasons the way all good working dogs eventually slow, a little longer to rise in the mornings, a little more careful on the porch steps in the wet weather. But the eyes never dulled, and the instinct that had once driven him across a burned foundation toward a hatch nobody else had thought to look under never once wavered. He still met every car at the gate. He still knew, before Everett did, which nights called for a shoulder pressed hard against a grieving man's leg, and which nights simply called for quiet company on the porch, watching the same eastern ridge Harlan Cole had once watched for 22 long years, waiting for someone patient enough to finally come finish what he'd started. Maybe there is a Camp Ashwood in your own life, a silence inherited without consent, a name reduced to one line of paperwork, or a truth everyone learned to walk around because opening it looked harder than living beside it. Everett did not heal by erasing what happened to Cash, and Camp Ashwood did not become whole by pretending Daniel Reyes had never died there. Healing began when the record finally agreed with the truth, when the living stopped protecting the silence, and when one old dog refused to leave a door buried simply because people had stopped looking for it. If this story moved you, subscribe to Silent Ranks K9 for more stories of loyalty, sacrifice, buried truth, and the second chances that begin when someone finally stops looking away. And tell us in the comments, if your dog could lead you to one truth the world had forgotten, would you be brave enough to open the door?